Lovely. Right, I'll make a start. Thanks everyone for coming to this session. It's a pleasure to be talking to you today about Anne Lister and Dorothy Wordsworth. So my name's Abby Palmer and I'm a PhD student at the University of Cumbria up in the Lake District. The title of my working thesis is I Feel Neither Man nor Woman in Society, Space, Place and Queer Identity in the Writing of Anne Lister. It's quite a wordy title, but my key focus is on how Anne Lister's identity shapes how she navigates the different spaces and places around her. But for this talk today, I've chosen to bring Lister into conversation with another diarist and writer who spent time in Halifax, Dorothy Wordsworth. For those of you who've been on the Halifax walking tours that happen during Anne Lister Birthday Week, you might already know quite a bit about Dorothy Wordsworth, and you might have been shown the house that she lived in. It was above her aunt's draper's shop. It's now a Greg's Bakery, which is quite funny. But above that is where she used to live, and what is the Greg's Bakery would have been a draper's shop. So that is where Dorothy lived during her childhood. But in today's talk, I'll show you what I'll cover. So we'll be looking at why I'm choosing to discuss Dorothy Wordsworth's writing alongside Anne Lister's. We'll talk a bit about who Dorothy Wordsworth was. We're also going to look at who Dorothy's aunt was, so Elizabeth Rawson, and that's the person she stayed with in Halifax. We'll look at Wordsworth and Lister's overlapping social circles of Halifax. And then hopefully throughout the talk, we'll be looking at the value of discussing Lister's journals alongside her contemporary writers and what kind of new insights that can bring. So why have I chosen to discuss Dorothy Wordsworth's writing alongside Lister's? About 3 years ago, when I was piecing together what would be my key focus for my PhD, I was debating researching both Dorothy Wordsworth and Anne Lister in comparison, but I quickly realised that I wouldn't have enough time to focus on both of these women due to there being so much writing material. We all know how vast Anne Lister's diaries are, and Dorothy Wordsworth's letters and journals are extensive too. I felt I wouldn't be able to give either writer the full attention they deserved. However, there is so much we can gain from comparing these two writers, and my passion to do this has actually grown since my PhD, so I love making a challenge for myself. As we'll look at in a moment, Dorothy Wordsworth spent key moments of her life in Halifax. Her writing reveals interesting insights into Halifax as a physical and social space. Although she was 20 years older than Lister, Wordsworth had a very similar Halifax social circle, which we'll take a look at later on. But before my PhD, I studied a master's in another wordy title, Literature, Romanticism and the English Lake District. And as part of this, I researched the writing of Dorothy Wordsworth. After this master's, I worked for just over a year at Wordsworth Grasmere, which is a museum and literary house of William and Dorothy Wordsworth, so what was Dove Cottage. So her writing, Wordsworth's writing, really has accompanied me throughout my time living in the Lake District. And I've really enjoyed kind of following her writing and her journeys through the Lake District. So let's look for a moment at who Dorothy Wordsworth was. I'm sure we all know who Lister was at this point, but we might be a little bit new to Dorothy's writing. So I was fascinated by how Dorothy Wordsworth captured life in the hamlet of Townend near Grasmere, where she lived, from 1799 to 1808, and the poetic journal entries she'd write about things that captured her interest. I was also intrigued by the sometimes unsung labour that she did for her brother, William Wordsworth. She would write out her brother's poetry for him in fast neat copy, and even provided the inspiration for what would become his most famous poem, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, or as it's most commonly known, Daffodils. The two siblings, William and Dorothy, seemed to work in a creative partnership, or as Dorothy Wordsworth's biographer Pamela Woolf articulates, a rare literary fellowship. And Dorothy supported her brother's work in countless ways, alongside being a creative herself. But Woolf recognises that Dorothy Wordsworth's connection to her brother William is a creative partnership, and she does recognise that. You can also recognise that Dorothy was an individual too. She was a diarist, poet, a writer, a walker, an individual with chronic illness, a devoted family member, passionate friend, and someone who deserves our attention. As Polly Atkin writes in Recovering Dorothy, and I quote, whilst this idea of Dorothy and William as one poetic being recenters Dorothy in the literary production that she has often been erased from, This presentation of her as half the poet Wordsworth has the unfortunate side effect of further marginalising her individual personhood and her individual creative work. She was a poet, or as she called herself, perhaps more than half a poet. She was a writer of journals and letters, and even wrote part of a guidebook, sorry for another wordy title, her Recollections of a Tour Made in Scotland, 1803. Perhaps my favourite fact about her is that she was the first woman, as far as we know, to write an account of climbing England's tallest mountain peak, Scafell Pike, in 1818. Another wordy title coming up. I'm so sorry. This is the theme of this talk, is wordy titles. So Dorothy Wordsworth's Scafell Pike hike was published in William Wordsworth's Description of the Scenery in the Lakes in the North of England. It's really long, this one. Dorothy was admonished by her Aunt Crackenthorpe just for walking alone in nature, but she didn't let societal norms prevent her from exploring the natural world how she saw fit, and walking was one of her favourite activities. So nothing really irritates me more than when I see people's first descriptions of Dorothy Wordsworth be, oh yeah, she was William Wordsworth's sister. Because before we say that, before that comes into our minds, there is so much more to discuss. Both Wordsworth and, as we know, Lister were people who went beyond what was expected, what was the norm, and they beat to their own drum in exciting ways. And I haven't just chosen to compare these two women because they were two women in Halifax. These two people have more similarities than meet the eye. And during this presentation, I hope to demonstrate that when we read Dorothy Wordsworth's writing, we can learn more about Lister's life in Halifax. And this does work vice versa as well. So bringing our prior knowledge of Lister to our reading of Wordsworth's letters and diaries, we can understand them a lot more. And I'd just like to add a little disclaimer before I continue, that a key moment that fueled my thoughts around Dorothy Wordsworth in Halifax was a conversation that I had with Nick Mason, who recently, with Suzanne Sutton, has edited and published Dorothy Wordsworth's later journals, her Rydal Journals. I helped host a visit he had at Rydal Mount, the home that Dorothy Wordsworth lived in later in life. And I recognise that it's impossible to cite a conversation with somebody or fully record what was said there. But I owe Nick a great deal for kickstarting some of the serious thought in this topic, and his footnotes and introductions to Wordsworth's Rydal Journals have been invaluable to my understanding of this, and they will feature throughout this presentation as well. So we're now going to look at a shortened timeline of Dorothy Wordsworth's life. This was extracted from Dorothy Wordsworth's Rydal Journals, the Nick Mason and Suzanne Sutton one, and this was kind of part of the introduction to that. So he did a really good biography. I've shortened this a bit because we just don't have time to bring everything in, but I've kept the relevant things. So in 1771, on the 25th of December, Dorothy Wordsworth was born in Cockermouth, Cumberland, as the third child of 5 siblings. Their father was the law agent for the Earl of Lonsdale, and as part of his role, they lived in quite a grand house, but that was provided for them. It wasn't actually a house that the family owned. In 1778, sadly, Dorothy Wordsworth's mother dies when she's 6 years old. In June of that year, she moves to Halifax to reside with her new guardian, Elizabeth Threlkeld. Polly Atkin writes in her book Recovering Dorothy that there was no place for an only girl in a motherless household, and that is what happened. So her brothers stayed in the Lake District and went to grammar school, and Dorothy was sent to live in Halifax with a female relative. In 1781, she begins a 3-year period as a boarding student at Hipper Home School near Halifax, during which she spends school breaks in Halifax with Miss Threlkeld and her Ferguson cousins. This is just the Greggs that she lived above. It's my photograph. And I got a sausage roll. It felt quite ceremonious, but yeah, so that she lived above there, and then where the Greggses would have been the shop. So in 1783, another piece of sad news, Dorothy Wordsworth's father dies 5 days after her 12th birthday. So she's, by the age of 12, experienced both of the loss of her parents and has become an orphan with her siblings at this point. But she continues to live in Halifax for a while until 1787, when she moves to Penrith to live with her cooks and grandparents above their mercer's shop. In December of the same year, William Cookson, the grandfather with whom she resides, also dies. So Dorothy has experienced a lot of loss at this point for a young child, and has obviously really had to process that and be moved around a bit as well. So she's gone through quite a lot at a young age. In 1794, she moves to Halifax area home of the former Miss Threlkeld, now Mrs. William Rawson, so more on that connection later, where she is reunited with Wordsworth for the first time in 3 years. April to August of that year, she travels with her brother Wordsworth to Grasmere, Keswick, Coppermouth, and Whitehaven, and then makes solo visits to various relations in Cumberland before returning to Halifax. So during this kind of period of time between 1794, 1799, she does a lot of travel, a lot with her brother. So she goes to a year-long stay in Alfoxden and the Wye Valley in Wales, and then in Germany as well, which they go with. I think she goes with her brother and the poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge as well. So a lot of travel at that point. And then in 1799, on the 20th of December, Dorothy Wordsworth and William Wordsworth move into Dove Cottage in Grasmere. Now, this really opens up a period of creativity for William and Dorothy, and it's quite a monumental step. So it's their first home they've had sort of settled in together as siblings after travelling, after being moved around quite a lot. And it does open up a big creative period for William Wordsworth. Dorothy's keeping her Grasmere journal and writing her own stuff, and William is writing quite a lot of poetry at this time. So we have a lot of material from this period from both William and Dorothy. In 1802, William Wordsworth marries Mary Hutchinson, and they go on to have 5 children. In 1805, another sad loss. So Dorothy Wordsworth's brother John dies in a shipwreck near Weymouth Bay. So that was a big loss for the family. They were probably closest to John, I would say, out of all their siblings. So it was a big loss. Again, there's lots of things happening during this time that are quite hard for them. They are having a joyful time at Dove Cottage amongst things that are going on, but sadly in 1812, this is after they've just left Dove Cottage and they've moved elsewhere. There's the death of Wordsworth and Mary's daughter Catherine, and then later that year, the death of Wordsworth and Mary's son Thomas. So they do lose 2 children. So Dorothy loses a niece and a nephew. In 1813, the household moves to Rydal Mount, and this is after moving a couple of times between Dove Cottage and Rydal Mount, but not quite finding a house that works for them. But Rydal Mount kind of opens that up. So they had to move from Dove Cottage to accommodate the size of the family now. The cottage was just getting too small. But in 1813, they moved to Rydal Mount, which is a bigger house. And both rented, so they rented Rydal Mount and they rented Dove Cottage. They never owned their property. But after they've moved, Dorothy visits Halifax quite a few times still. So in 1816 to 17, 1827 and 1829, Dorothy visits Halifax. She does die in 1855 on the 25th of January at Rydal Mount. She dies a few years after her brother and a few years before her sister-in-law, Mary. So she's kind of in the middle of those two. So I hope that's helped just give a little bit of background to who Dorothy Wordsworth was and a bit of kind of a timeline of her life. But we're going to look now a little bit at Elizabeth Threlkeld. So as we've just seen in the timeline, she had a close connection with Halifax from being 6 years old when she began to view it as her home. After the tragic death of her mother, Wordsworth was looked after by Elizabeth Threlkeld, dubbed her mother's favourite cousin, for 9 years. So Miss Threlkeld, who Dorothy often called her Aunt Threlkeld, or Aunt Rawson later on, was born in Halifax in 1745, daughter of Reverend Samuel Threlkeld, who was minister of Northgate End Chapel. Elizabeth had several siblings, including an elder sister, Anne, who married John Ferguson. And John Ferguson was a draper who lived in Southgate. When Anne sadly died, so this is Elizabeth Threlkeld's sister, when Anne sadly died in 1775, Elizabeth went to live above the shop to help take care of the household and their 5 children. So the photo of the Greggs and the above that we just saw, she moved into that after Anne died to help take care of the family and look after the shop a little bit too. So when Dorothy went to live with her aunt, she was kept company by the orphaned Ferguson children. So when Dorothy moved in, there were already orphaned children with her. Dorothy's guardian, Elizabeth Threlkeld, was a kind-hearted, caring person who many people, even Lister, spoke well of. I think Lister called her a civil person, which for Lister is quite high praise, I think. She also became one of the key links between Lister and Wordsworth, as we'll look at. So in 1791, Elizabeth Threlkeld married William Rawson. William's father was the Christopher Rawson who bought the land at Stony Royd and built Stony Royd House. It's his son that's the William that Elizabeth married. The Rawsons can get a little bit confusing, but I hope that hope that sort of makes sense. But after Elizabeth Threlkeld and William Rawson married in 1791, they lived at Mill House in Triangle. They moved to Savile Green in 1806. This is also something that added to my confusion because they moved out of Mill House and then another William Rawson moved into Mill House. So for a while I was like, which William Rawson are they talking about? But then you start to see the nuances, and the later William Rawson was called William Henry Rawson, and so that was often how he was referred to. But it can be a little bit of a maze when you're sort of digging around the archives. But yeah, so Elizabeth and William Rawson moved to Savile Green in 1806, and they lived happily together until William Rawson's death in 1828. So Elizabeth Rawson, as she became to be known, would live until 1837. Dorothy's visits to Halifax later in her life were primarily to visit Mrs. Rawson as she became older. Though, as we'll see, socialising was a really important aspect for her too. But Lister also visited Elizabeth and William Rawson on numerous occasions, often seeing the extended Rawson family and friends at the same time. On occasions, her Aunt Elizabeth Threlkeld, or Mrs. William Rawson, as she could also be referred to after marriage, would call on Lister at Shibden Hall, but we'll look a bit more at that later on. So I was going to talk a bit about Jane Pollard. I might skip this a tiny bit because I've thrown a lot of biographical information at you, but I will just say another key figure in Dorothy's life at this time, sort of throughout her youth in Halifax and throughout her life, was Jane Pollard. This is a friend she met when she was 7 years old. They met in school in Halifax and they went on to have very different lives. So Jane married John Marshall in 1795 and they went on to have 12 children, which was a lot. And Dorothy obviously didn't marry and didn't have children, and therefore they did live very different lives, but they remained very good friends. And Jane married John Marshall, who was a flax mill owner from Leeds and so was quite wealthy. I'm just going to read that comment in case it's important. So Mrs. Rawson, she was Mrs. It's a bit confusing, but she was Elizabeth Threlkeld, and she married William Rawson, who then they moved to Savile Green. So it's an aunt and it's kind of an aunt and uncle that of Dorothy that Anne would sometimes visit, but I don't think they were as important in Anne's life as a lot of the other Rawsons, if that makes sense. So I mentioned Jane Pollard a little bit because it's often in Dorothy's letters to Jane Pollard that we learn a lot about Elizabeth Threlkeld and about kind of their relationship. So it's through those letters that we see a lot of that. So this is me and Cece, who you might have met at the Lister birthday week, outside Dove Cottage. So this is Dorothy's kind of first home with William. So alongside the descriptive, often passionate letters that Wordsworth wrote, she did keep a journal on and off throughout her life. So there's two sections of her life which are published now. So we've got the Grasmere and Alfoxden journals that she wrote from 1798 to 1803, and the recently published Rydal Journals, which began in 1824. Compared to her letters, and actually in fact to Lister's journal style, Wordsworth tends to write a lot less than Lister. This isn't to say that she didn't on occasion write in great detail at times, and actually her time at Dove Cottage was probably when she wrote the most poetically and creatively. But amidst kind of, the everyday writings, especially at the time of them living in Dove Cottage, she wrote a lot of poetic writing. Pamela Worth, so Dorothy Wordsworth biographer, writes, Wordsworth's earlier journals are a nature diary in that she observes the seasons, she observes the climate, she observes the liveliness of nature. She sees nature as alive. So in this extract from Dorothy's Grasmere journal, written on the 29th of April, 1802, she writes, "We rested a long time under a wall. Sheep and lambs were in the field, cottages smoking. As I lay down on the grass, I observed the glittering silver line on the ridges of the backs of the sheep, owing to their situation respecting the sun, which made them look beautiful, but with something of strangeness, like animals of another kind, as if belonging to another world. Met old Mr. S at the door, Mrs. S poorly. I got mullens and pansies. I was sick and ill and obliged to come home soon. So Wordsworth's Grasmere journals are filled with these really evocative descriptions of the natural world. They're surrounded by the day-to-day matter-of-fact happenings that she needed to keep track of. So we've got this beautiful passage, and then I was sick and ill and obliged to come home soon. And you see a lot of that in these journals. But comparatively, her visits to Halifax in 1827 and 1829 are much less poetically written. The journals take on a function to note take, to keep track of the different houses she visited and different places she had been to. They seem to serve as a function to remember key details of her busy social visits, perhaps to retell her family once she returned from Halifax. Luckily for us, we do have the letters to turn to as well, and Pamela Woolf estimates that she wrote over 700 letters in her lifetime. But one of the key similarities that drew me to compare to Lister and Wordsworth together were their social circles. Perhaps the most annoying thing about discussing these two women is they never met anywhere that we can find, and they never really talked about each other anywhere we can find, which is really surprising considering the overlap that these two have. There's just no mention of each other, and it's really strange. One of the few times Lister mentions a Wordsworth is when she's discussing the writing of William Wordsworth, so Dorothy's brother, and she says Steph prefers Southey, Hope, and Wordsworth to Lord Byron, not so M&I. So not the nicest comment anyway about Wordsworth's poetry there. Much prefers Lord Byron. But Lister also reads William Wordsworth's son Christopher's Athens and Attica in 1837. That is as far as any mentions of the name Wordsworth go. That's all we have to go on. There's nothing to suggest that these two ever met, ever had a conversation, or ever thought about each other. There must have been some situations in which the names came up, so it's a bit of a puzzle. This sort of unacknowledgement of one another is highlighted in Lister's visit to the Lake District with her aunt in 1824. They travel from Ambleside to Keswick on Wednesday, 28th of July, and stop off at the village of Rydal, which their carriage would have had to pass through to get to their destination, so they use it as a stop-off point. They decide to visit Rydal Hall, home of the wealthy Le Flemings, which is adjacent to Rydal Mount, where the Wordsworth lived. They are next to each other. And actually, the Le Flemings rented Rydal Mount to the Wordsworths, so it's still all their land, but yeah, just slightly separate. Lister describes walking to see the waterfalls and the grot in the grounds, which is a little kind of viewing station of the waterfall, which you can see in the photo on the left. Lister then mentions the church at Rydal, which the Flemings are in the process of building, and she writes, Rydal water very pretty, and that's that. She moves on to Grasmere, and that is the closest we get to any sort of mention of a Wordsworth, and it just doesn't happen. Researchers have presented suggestions as to why this may have been. For example, it was customary to call ahead before calling on people you didn't know very well, and maybe she didn't think to do that and kind of didn't want to impose herself. But ordinarily, you would expect some sort of note, say, past Rydal Mount, home of the Wordsworths, or some kind of little thing in her travel notes, but there's nothing there. But one of the guidebooks she's using for this trip, which you can see on the right, this is taken at the Armit Museum in Ambleside. One of the guidebooks she uses is Mrs. Murray's Guide to the Lakes, and this gives a lot of directions on what to stop off and see. And it says, and I quote, see Sir Michael Le Flemings at Rydal Hall, so that's the big Rydal Hall house. See also the Ambleside Fall within half a mile of the town. And then from Lowood to Keswick, it's 18 miles, one of the finest drives in the world. In that road, observe Rydal Water and the rocky romantic pass between it and Grasmere. And Lister does just that. She follows those instructions. She stops at Rydal to see Rydal Hall and the Le Flemings, and does see Ambleside Falls before that. I won't go much into the guidebook use because I actually want to do a talk on that for the Anne Lister conference next year, so I'll save that material. But you can see that she does follow the instructions of Mrs. Murray very closely, and it is a guidebook that she really comes to rely on during that visit to the Lake District. It might contribute as to why she didn't stop and see the Wordsworths, so she was following that guidebook and there was no mention of them. But there's so many things that it could be. So a few other theories are, it could be because the Wordsworths rented Rydal Mount from the Le Flemings, and in comparison, sizable house seemed tiny compared to Rydal Hall. They were different economic statuses, different classes. It could be that they'd gone so long without an established connection that trying to connect one now might have seemed awkward. But even so, these theories don't explain why there wasn't a little note in her travel notes to say that they'd been past the house. But on the left there, you can see Rydal Hall, which is very large. It's got extensive grounds as well. And then Rydal Mount is on the right, and that's more of a cottage style house, more kind of, it's still a sizable house, don't get me wrong, but comparatively to Rydal Hall, much smaller and smaller grounds as well. So yeah, that total absence of a mention, it feels like a purposeful omission from Lister. I can't explain it otherwise, but I can't fathom it, and it's going to be one that kind of sits with me for a while. So any discussion points or any thoughts around that are very much welcomed. So whatever the reasoning was between that kind of visit, this distance between Lister and Dorothy is quite surprising. Both women had very strong connections to Halifax and, of course, the Lake District, and both had ties, amicable or not, to the Rawsons. Lister knew Dorothy's aunt Elizabeth Threlkeld Rawson too. So in 1817, 7 years before her visit to the Lake District, she writes in her journal that Mrs. William Rawson and Miss Threlkeld called. They took me to Halifax in the carriage. So they stopped off at Shipton Hall. And then in 1817, Lister writes that she called at Mr. William Rawson's, which is Dorothy's aunt's husband, after leaving her father and her aunt at Northgate. Then, in October of the same year, Lister writes that Mrs. Ralph called on my aunt this morning and told her how ill Mr. William Rawson was, that he himself did not expect to recover, but has said he was going to leave them soon. So this is quite worrying, and Lister continues to note his progress in her journal. And although thinking for a moment he was getting better, Lister writes, and I quote, "My uncle Lister asked Dr. Paley how Mr. William Rawson was. He said as much as there was no chance of his recovering, that he was in a very dangerous way, and with the same complaint as my uncle Joseph's, a bleeding from the liver." Thankfully, despite this really harsh wording and this kind of worrying situation, diary entries from the days that followed, describe Mr. Rawson recovering. Sorry, I had a moment there. And a few days after the worst of his illness, Lister calls upon him, so she goes to visit Mr. Rawson. She says she saw Mr. Rawson for 5 minutes. She said he was a good deal better, was able to sit up in a little adjoining room, had a great deal of pain at times. So she did actually go and see that he was okay, and she demonstrates care and worry for him at this time of illness. Thankfully, Mr. Rawson does continue to live for another 10 years after this scare, but he does suffer from recurrent health flare-ups, and we see this documented in both Lister and Wordsworth's writing. But Lister's is actually really important in us following health flare-ups that Mr. Rawson had. Also in her journal, Lister mentions seeing the Fergusons a few times when she makes social calls. So that's the orphan children that Dorothy lived with when she was younger. She doesn't remark on them in detail, but she comments on seeing them during house calls, and this is another direct link to Dorothy Wordsworth, as the Ferguson. Oh, I've just said that. Never mind. But yeah, they were that connection between Dorothy Wordsworth and Lister. So Lister does socialise with those kind of people on many occasions, the Threlkelds and the Fergusons. And you're not telling me at some point that Dorothy didn't come up in conversation when Lister was in these spaces. I can't understand how it didn't. There's no note of it in either of their writing. So when Wordsworth did visit in the winter of 1816 to 1817, you see this kind of uneasiness come out a little bit with the roles that were going on in the Rawsons' home, so her Aunt Rawson's home. In a letter to her friend Catherine Clarkson, she writes, "There I was in a large house with two old people, servants to perform the work as by magic, no child's voice, all perfect stillness. True it is that they are the most cheerful and happy old people I was ever acquainted with, yet how different the cheerfulness of their fireside from the cheerfulness of ours, and how different the seriousness. I was very happy there, yet now that I am placed again in the perfect freedom of home, I rejoice many times in every day I am here, saying how glad I am that I am among you once again." And I think this highlights the financial and social differences once again between Wordsworth and Lister. So Wordsworth points out the servants performing the work as by magic, which could be something that she's not quite accustomed to. I'm sure they had help around Rydal Mount, but not quite the amount of servants for the amount of people. So they've got quite a few for just her aunt and uncle there. It's interesting to see how she takes this environment as well. I wonder if it's kind of a novelty for her, as she would usually partake in some of the household tasks that the servants here are doing. And Dorothy was quite involved in the household, and it seems like here she's been asked to really take a step back, and that's different for her. So in 1958, a writer from the Halifax Antiquarian Society, John Wilson, wrote a pamphlet titled Mrs. William Rawson and Her Diary. So I'd been struggling away for quite a while trying to piece together information about her, about Elizabeth Threlkeld, who became William Rawson, Mrs. William Rawson. And then I found this pamphlet, and it's brilliant. These are photos from the Durwood Centre, which is part of Dove Cottages and the Wordsworth Trust archive. And I was able to read this, and it's really interesting because she didn't really keep a diary as such, although it's called a diary there. It's more like a little account book of the house and a record of the social people, the social calls and the people that she saw. So you can see an example of that on the right image. I know it's quite small. You can kind of see like dined at Willow Field, saw Mrs. Dyson, Mr. Edward. So it's kind of more of a listing of who she's seen and what she's been up to. So in this pamphlet, Wilson notes down the expenses of the servants in the house from the notes from Mrs. Rawson's kind of diary. And it was as follows. So 6 main servants appear to have been employed. Cook at £12 to £14 a year, 2 maids at £3 to £6 a year, a coachman at £21, 12 shillings a year, gardener at £25, 4 shillings a year, and an assistant at £15, 12 shillings a year. And there are also signs of casual extra help, so people who would come in and do tasks for them that maybe weren't employed all year would come and do things for them. I calculated this, and it came to about £6,000 a year in today's money, which for 6 staff I actually thought was quite low. But I don't think the Wordsworths would have been able to afford or expense this kind of thing. And so this really does indicate that gap again between what the Wordsworths were used to, so William, Dorothy, his wife, and the children living at Rydal Mount, and what people like Elizabeth Rawson and Anne Lister might have been used to at this time. So let's now have a look at Wordsworth's last 2 visits to Halifax. So these are in 1827 and 1829. Unfortunately, during both of these visits, Lister was away. So in 1827, she was visiting Switzerland and northern Italy. And in 1829, she was back in Paris. And then she started travelling the Rhine, I think, with Lady Caroline of Gordon and her family. So sadly, there's no chance at all for these last 2 visits of them bumping into each other. And my theory is that this would have been the visit they probably did, because the social circles were so overlapped, but also there was still obviously an age gap there, but it feels a little bit more evened out at this point rather than there being quite a big gap before. Kind of, I don't know if that makes sense, but it just felt like this would be the visit in which they would bump into each other. But you can see here, these are the people that Wordsworth socialised with in 1827 and 1829, and there's a lot of overlap there. So from people like the Rawsons, of course, Dr. Kenny, the Saltmarshes, the Priestleys. I mean, most people on there we recognise from Anne Lister's journal. So if they'd both been in Halifax at the same time during these visits, I think it would have been highly unlikely that they didn't bump into each other. So Nick Mason writes in his Dorothy Wordsworth's Rydal Journals kind of introduction, part 3. So similar were their circles that the diarists almost certainly would have met had Lister not been away on the continent during both of Dorothy's final 2 visits. So it's not just me that thinks this. So does Nick Mason and Suzanne Tilton. There is definitely that feeling of they've just missed each other when you read both of these together. But unfortunately, as Nick Mason further explains, since none of Dorothy's letters from the 1827 trip survive, it hasn't received much attention from critics and biographers, so it further obscures the depth of her attachment to Halifax and further bridges that gap between what we know as researchers and Dorothy's love for Halifax as a space. So with that lack of letters from 1827, we're reliant on what the diaries tell us about this visit. And in fact, it's quite similar to what we just saw in her aunt Mrs. Rawson's diary. So when you read Dorothy's diary from this time, it's very much who she saw and what she did rather than much feeling coming out. And that's when we would normally turn to her letters, but in this case, we don't have much to go on. But mainly, probably with little time to write, Wordsworth keeps to those short descriptions of her social activity. She does have one comment which really stands out to me, which is she calls Halifax a clear, smokeless town in 1827, which is quite a compliment for Halifax, I think, at that time, especially because Wordsworth has, outside of that, often commented on it being not clear and smokeless. So it might just be that she had it on a good day, or it might be that she was particularly enjoying that visit. But yeah, she called it a clear, smokeless town. And another bit that stands out from me from the 1827 visit is that she says she had a walk on Beacon Hill alone. And you know what? I do not blame her because the amount of socializing she did in these visits, she would have a day in the carriage with the Rawsons and they would just go around and socialize. And then on other days, they would have social call, social call, social call. It was constant. And I'm sure she loved that interaction. But I'm sure it was also very tiring. I definitely couldn't do it. So she did very well at kind of maintaining all of that. But it's also quite special to imagine Dorothy Wordsworth walking these paths that Lister also trod. And it's almost like if I saw it in a film, there would be a montage and they would sort of be walking past each other, but as ghosts or as like visions, because they just keep missing each other. And it's so interesting to me. But yeah, it's really nice to imagine Dorothy just up on Beacon Hill alone, getting some quiet time, getting some time away from that busy social life that she's having there. And those of us who've been up to Beacon Hill, I think, will know how restorative that can be. It's almost like you're in a different world, but you're still able to look down on Halifax, but you're in this kind of quiet space up high, away from it all. So, sadly, between Dorothy Wordsworth's visits in 1827 and 1829, William Rawson dies. So, this is her aunt's husband. So, with it, yeah, so sorry, had a brain moment. So in 1828, Mr. William Rawson passes away, and Anne Lister writes about this in her journal. So she says, on the 26th of August, 1828, she writes, Mr. William Rawson of Savile Green died early this morning, worn out by old age 80. And after a couple of weeks had passed from this entry, on the 15th of September, Lister makes a call to Mrs. Catherine Rawson. So she writes, called at Mrs. Catherine Rawson's on the death of her brother, Mr. William Rawson, not at home, then on the widow, Savile Green, which is Elizabeth Rawson. Sat about 10 minutes with her and her nieces, then two Miss Fergusons. Mrs. William Rawson, speaking of the garden, said, Mr. Rawson used to be quite very fond of it, very composed, in quite good enough spirits for any time. So this is probably one of the most intimate descriptions I have found about Wordsworth's aunt. So that human moment of dwelling on a memory with your husband, surrounded by family and friends in a time of grief. It's also quite telling of Lister. She chooses to call on who she describes as the widow of Savile Green. And there's no mention when Lister visits of her feeling any pressure to entertain or amuse them, which she often felt when she would visit people's houses. Lister would write that I managed to entertain them or I managed to amuse them. And at this point, I think Lister's really just caring in this moment, and it's really nice to read. But that kind of insight we get of Mrs. Rawson reflecting on her husband is just a really intimate moment that we don't get much of when it comes to Mrs. Rawson. But yeah, so instead of trying to entertain or amuse them, Lister feels like she can just sit with them and listen to that moment. And it is, yeah, a special moment to read about. So the same year, Wordsworth falls ill on her travels to Whitwick, so Dorothy Wordsworth becomes poorly in 1828. She travelled to Whitwick to see her brother John. Whitwick's in Leicestershire in the UK. She suffered a violent illness that she never really recovered from at this time. We don't have much information about her illness at this point. Polly Atkin in Recovering Dorothy, which is a book on the screen, she writes there's a gap in her journals at this time, and Dorothy only really fills in details later to say that she was taken very ill on April the 3rd. Dorothy Wordsworth did manage to go to Halifax in 1829 whilst managing the symptoms of her condition, but she wasn't very well and had flare-ups. She stayed with her Aunt Rawson again and made several social calls, so same kind of story as last time, but really trying to do that whilst fighting her illness, which was quite difficult. During her stay, she visits Northgate Chapel, and this is quite funny. She remarks that there were two curious mistakes during the sermon. So, one of the mistakes was the curate read the evening service instead of the morning service. And then the second thing that she writes is that he used the word disregardless at least 6 times, which really bothered her because that's not a word. So she was, yeah, she doesn't write much in her journal apart from what she was up to. So that must have really bothered her to make it into the journal. Um, During this visit, she also visits Jeremiah Rawson's mill on Old Lane and remarks that there was neatness, 110 power looms in each room. So it's an interesting visit. Again, we don't get much, which is a shame, but 110 power looms in each room, still more than I knew before. So it's interesting that she visited that mill as well as Jeremiah Rawson. But towards the end of her stay in 1829, she did suffer a relapse, which extended her Halifax stay by necessity. So she had to stay in Halifax and recover. In a letter to Sir George Beaumont, William Wordsworth, so her brother, writes that Dorothy is at Halifax in Yorkshire, where she was left by my son recovering from the effects of her late dangerous illness. So Dorothy refers to this illness as cholera morbus, which affected like your stomach and you would feel sick, have diarrhea, that kind of thing. But we don't know much more than that. And it feels like this illness continues for longer than that. This causes more symptoms afterwards. So it's not something we can quite define at this point, but it did definitely make her very poorly. In his footnotes to the Rydal Journals, Nick Mason explains that and this is a quote, that what Dorothy had anticipated being a short bereavement visit to her Aunt Elizabeth Rawson, whose husband had died 10 months earlier, ultimately lasted 10 weeks because Dorothy's health relapsed in Halifax and no family member would be available to nurse her in Rydal until early September. So instead, she stayed with Mrs. Rawson, and tried to recover and feel better enough to travel. She did, though, manage to have social visits, attending plenty of houses such as Mill House, which was now lived in by William Henry Rawson, High Nest, which was where the Priestleys were, Ash Grove to visit John Rawson, Stony Royd to visit Nellie Rawson, and many more. In a diary entry on the 19th of July, 1829, she writes this, a long round of calls all the morning in the carriage. So again, that kind of travelling round, stopping off, calling in on people. And she also visited the shared public spaces in Halifax, such as the library and Northgate Chapel, and intended going to a lecture, but was chill and cold. And I can't figure out if she means that the weather was chill and cold or that she herself was feeling chill and cold from her illness, but that's why she decides not to go to the lecture. But she was trying to interact with those spaces in Halifax as well. So it was a very busy time for her, but she was being tired and limited by her illness. So after a busy spell of socialising on that visit, there were entries lasting a few days of her noting in her diary that she was not well. And she said that she was being lazy in the garden, but obviously she was trying to recover in the garden. And she says that she was weak and ill as well. In 1830, about a year after her Halifax relapse, she writes to Henry Crabb Robinson, it was a sad illness I had at Whitwick, and again I was very ill at Halifax, whence I came to Rydal the first week of September, and since have not slept one night from home. So she really was having to recover at home, and if I remember rightly, I don't think she travelled anywhere else after this. I think she very much stayed in the Lake District because her health was limiting her now. I don't have enough time to speak in depth about Dorothy Wordsworth's illness today, and I'm not necessarily the best person to, so I would recommend reading Recovering Dorothy by Polly Atkin if you're interested in how Dorothy Wordsworth's illness affected her throughout her life. I really, really would recommend that book. So, in conclusion, when I was visiting the overlaps between, when I was researching the overlaps between Wordsworth and Lister, I didn't anticipate how important my research into Elizabeth Threlkeld or Elizabeth Rawson would become. I really didn't expect it to go down that route. But I realised how much of an important role she played in Wordsworth's life and how much of a connection she had with Lister as well. By talking about her, we gain more detail about key events, such as William Rawson's illness and his death and the grief that Mrs. Rawson felt. But Lister's journals really help us in understanding that, so we can look at both of their writing together to piece together how that was for them. And in turn, our knowledge of Wordsworth's social circles helps us understand the wider social circles of Halifax and how a lot of the upper class families socialise with one another. To have Wordsworth's perspectives on visiting the Rawsons and their network of family and friends helps add extra detail to our understanding of the upper class in Halifax. So Halifax was a place of fond memories, friendships, family connections, and joy for Dorothy Wordsworth. And I'll finish today's talk with this quote, which is again from Nicholas Mason's Rydal Journals. This is in his introduction to the Halifax section. So amid Dorothy's early struggles with dementia, her brother would report that despite being unable to keep her attention sustained upon things that formerly used to interest her, she talks much of Halifax and all her early connections there. Nothing indeed seems to employ her thoughts so much. Next slide, please. And that's everything. Thank you so much. Thanks for listening. Thank you. I'm just going to see if I can find the questions. Lovely. Thanks, everyone. That's really nice. Like a virtual applause. I really like that. Thank you. So I think I've got a few minutes for questions, and Jess has kindly compiled them for me in a separate chat, so I'm just going to read those. Did she ascend Scafell Pike solo? No, she was with another female friend, I think. I don't know if they were also accompanied by a larger party. They may have been, but she does write that she went up with a female friend who I'm sorry I've forgotten the name of. But no, she wasn't completely on her own for that. I have read Wanderers: A History of Women Walking, and I would really recommend that book as well. So that is a book by Kerry Andrews, and it talks about lots of different women throughout history who were kind of pioneers in walking and people that we don't necessarily read about as being pioneers in walking. And it's a brilliant book. I really like Kerry's other writing. So she's written Wanderers and then she's written Waymaking as well, and both are really good books if you want to read a bit more on that experience. Yeah, I think it's a brilliant book. Can we surmise much about Dorothy Wordsworth's politics from her writing? So, when they were living at Dove Cottage, William and Dorothy Wordsworth, so Dorothy and her brother William, um, they were very political and they were quite liberal. They were friends with anti-slavery campaigners and very much believed in that. They were a lot of people called them revolutionaries. They were sort of it's very hard to word, but they were yeah, they stood up for what they believed in and they were quite progressive for the time period. It's hard to know Dorothy's politics sometimes separate from William's. And I don't want to conflate them into one being in this way. So I will say that William is the person I know more about his politics and his political opinions. And yeah, he was quite radical, is a word people would use at the time of living at Dove Cottage. So was very strong in what he believed in much fairer rights for people. As they got older, William did have more conservative political views, so he did shift a bit as he got older. I'm afraid I don't know much about Dorothy's politics separate from that. I don't know whether she followed that same trajectory or not. I'm sure people out there will know that and will have done research into that political side of her. But I'm not quite sure, I'm afraid. But I know that's how William's kind of trajectory went. Do you have a favourite episode or passage from Dorothy's journal? Oh, let me have a look if I've got my book with me. I bookmarked a couple that I really like. Let me see if I can find them. Oh, it's so hard to pick one, and the bookmarks sound very good. Um, I will come back to that one. I might be able to find something at the end, but I don't want to take up too much question time. I'll try and find one, and if not, I will put it in the chat. Actually, that's what I'll do. I will find the passage that I'm thinking of as my favourite one, and I'll write it in the chat afterwards. Let me have a look. Has there ever been any inference that Dorothy may have also loved women? doesn't fully explain why Lister doesn't mention her or her brother at all, but could explain a distancing, as she inconsistently did with Francis Pickford. There have been discussions about Dorothy's sexuality. I didn't have really time to bring it in today, unfortunately, but there have been some really interesting discussions. There have been people who've interpreted Dorothy Wordsworth's writing through an asexual and aromantic lens because she doesn't actually tend to write much about attraction to somebody, anything sexual. She's not really written much about that at all. She stays away from that. But there's also been people who've argued that Dorothy may have been into women or been bisexual, because her friendship with Jane Pollard, for example, is what you would call from that time a sort of female friendship. So a friendship that's really intimate. She would write to her saying, "My dear Jane," and she would write really intimately to Jane. She saw herself at one point wanting to set up a house with Jane and her brother, and actually that those three would live together. And so there were really interesting discussions about whether that is more than a friendship. And I would probably argue it could be. It's really interesting to read into if you're interested in that. Trying to think if there's anything I'd recommend, but I'm not sure I can think of anything at the moment. But if I do, I'll pop it in the chat of any materials that go into that a bit more. But there were a few connections in Dorothy's life, what were called female friendships, which I use that term in quotes because that's a lot of the time what was referred to as people could be in a relationship, but they would be called that. But having said that, there were a lot of intimate female friendships at the time, so it's a really hard distinction. But I think, yeah, in Dorothy's case, it is hard to distinguish, but there are times when she writes to her female friends in a really beautiful way, in a really intimate way, and you do wonder if it was more than that. But yeah, a really good question. Thank you. Let me just see. Yeah, I'm just going to respond to somebody put a comment rather than a question, but I think it's important to read out. So somebody put, "This is so interesting." And I think this is about them not seeing each other in the Lake District. "This is so interesting as there are other instances where Lister visited locations associated with literary figures she did not personally care for example, Walter Scott. And when determined, she would endeavour to make visits to those she didn't know, like the ladies of Llangollen." And yes, that is very true, which adds to the complexity, because she could very much have imposed herself in that way. She did in the past, as this comment says, do that when she really wanted something. And so did she just not want to? And if so, why did she not want to? And if she didn't want to, why not make a note of that in the journal? And it's really interesting. And yeah, that comment's really good. Thank you. It does make you wonder again, because there's been times in the past she has been really insistent. Why wasn't she at this time? You mentioned Dorothy went to a boarding school in Hipperholm. Was this the Miss Mellon school? It was. Yes, it was, I think. Yes, I think I have read that it was. So hopefully I'm getting that right. But I think it was the Miss Mellon school. And I think that's all my questions. I will definitely find my favourite passage and put it in the chat because I think there's lots and I can't quite decide at the moment, but I will find it and pop it in there. Oh, question. Are Dorothy's journals accessible? Yes, so Dorothy's Grasmere and our Foxton journals you can get as an Oxford edition. So this is the one I have and actually edited by Pamela Worth. And that one, this one says £8.99. It's probably gone up since I bought it, but very accessible to buy. And you can often find secondhand copies of them too. The Rydal Journals that Nicholas Mason and Suzanne Sutton brought out were published with Liverpool University Press, which is it's an academic press, and so it's quite an expensive book. I think it's 175 around that mark. I get it through the university, so I have institutional access to that. And if there's the odd page or the odd section people would like to read, I can help with that. But unfortunately, that one has just come out as an academic book, so it is a little bit pricey to buy, but you can buy it and you can actually ask your libraries as well, because some libraries might stock it and be able to help you there. The volume of writing. So this is the Grasmere and Foxton Journal. So quite a slim volume, and this is from 1798, I think, to 1803. And the later journals, there was a kind of gap, a big gap where Dorothy wasn't writing a journal. And then when she comes to the Rydal Journals, there is a lot of material there. It's quite a hefty book. But comparatively to Lister, If you were trying to put listers into a book, obviously it would be a lot smaller. So still readable and still accessible, but yeah, not quite as big, of course, as unlisted writing. Unless there's any other questions, I will end there if that's okay. But if I'll be around for the rest of the session, so if you think of any, let me know and I will answer them in the chat at some point, or you can pop me a message. Thank you
Thank
so
you so
much.
much. Thanks, Abby. We will send Abby to the breakout room with you all. That way, if you do have more questions, you can continue to catch up there. And then we will see you back here in a few minutes for Jeremy Lister's terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day.